At 8:20 p.m. in front of 300 of the city's most influential people, my mother took the stage at my own charity gala. She announced she was suing me for my grandparents' entire 35 million estate. She called me irresponsible, a paramedic unfit to manage their legacy. The room went silent. All eyes were on me, waiting for me to break. They didn't see the small nod I gave my lawyer. My mother had no idea that her lawsuit filed at 9 a.m. that morning had triggered a hidden clause in a contract she signed years ago. The countdown had already begun. That night at the gala was the culmination of a war that began 6 weeks earlier in a quiet wood-paneled office that smelled of old books and rain. I was sitting across from Matthew Goldstein, my grandparents' lawyer and friend. The grief was still a physical weight, a hollowness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. He had been kind, sharing a story about my grandfather's terrible chess skills before my family arrived. They did not enter so much as descend upon the office. My mother, Victoria, led the charge, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Her designer handbag, a stark white rectangle, probably cost more than my last 3 months of rent. She surveyed the room with a look of bored impatience, as if this whole process was a tedious inconvenience. My stepfather, Robert, followed quietly in her wake, his expression neutral as always. My mother announced it was time to get this over with. Some people had actual lives to run. Matthew gave a thin, polite smile and led us into the conference room. I chose a seat near him, needing the proximity to someone who felt like an ally. Victoria sat at the opposite end of the long oak table, claiming the seat of power. Matthew began by stating for the record that my grandparents, Frank and Maria, were of perfectly sound mind when they drafted their final will just 8 months ago. My mother waved a dismissive hand, telling him to just get to the numbers. He cleared his throat and began to read. The legal language was a drone at first, a list of revocations and appointments. Then he arrived at the heart of it. He detailed their assets, the portfolio of commercial properties, the warehouses downtown, the retail spaces, the liquid assets in various investment accounts. My mother leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. Then Matthew said the number, $35 million. A collective inhale went through the room. I felt dizzy. My grandparents lived in the same simple ranch house for 50 years. They drove the same reliable car, 35 million. It felt like a number from another reality. Matthew continued, his voice steady. He said, "And to my beloved granddaughter, Sarah Foster, I hereby bequeath my entire estate." The silence that followed was louder than any sound I had ever heard. It was a vacuum sucking all the air out of the room. I could feel my mother's eyes on me, hot and sharp. I was certain I had misheard. Victoria's voice, when it finally cut through the silence, was pure ice. She told Matthew to read that again. He calmly repeated the clause. She called it utterly ridiculous. She stood up her chair, scraping harshly against the floor, shouting that I must have manipulated them. She accused me of taking advantage of 2 old, confused people. Her voice grew louder, laced with a theatrical disbelief that was meant for an audience. I just sat there frozen. The man I saved in the ambulance last week, his life hanging by a thread that was real. This felt like a bizarre dream. Matthew calmly explained the extensive medical evaluations my grandparents had undergone to certify their competence. But Victoria was not listening. She was looking at me, her face a mask of cold fury. "This is not over," she said, her voice dangerously low. "This is not even close to being over. We will be discussing this tonight. At my house, 7 o'clock. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. The drive to my mother's house felt longer than usual. Her neighborhood was a world away from my simple apartment complex, a curated landscape of sprawling modern houses and perfectly manicured lawns. As I pulled into her circular driveway, I saw my stepfather Robert through the large front window staring out. He turned away as soon as my headlights hit the glass. The air inside was cool and sterile, smelling faintly of the expensive floral arrangements my mother insisted on having delivered weekly. The meeting, it turned out, was not just with her. My Aunt Carol and Uncle Ben were there too, my mother's sister and her husband. They were arranged on the uncomfortable white sofas in the formal living room, a space that always felt more like a museum exhibit than a place for family. They looked like a tribunal, and I was the one on trial. My mother began immediately, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. She told me, "Darling, we all know you loved your grandparents, but a $35 million real estate empire is a complex business. It requires experience. It requires a certain kind of person to manage it properly." The implication was clear. It required someone like her, not a paramedic who got her hands dirty for a living. I stayed silent, letting her lay out her plan. It was simple, really. She wanted me to sign a document that would grant her power of attorney over the entire estate. She would manage everything and, in her words, ensure I was well taken care of. She would give me a generous allowance, enough to buy a nice condo and a new car. She said it with a magnanimous air, as if she were bestowing a great gift upon me, instead of demanding I surrender everything my grandparents had entrusted to me. I looked around the room. My Aunt Carol nodded in agreement, adding that it was the only sensible option. Ben, as usual, just stared at his shoes. I thought about my grandfather Frank. I remembered being 16, standing on a dusty construction site with him on a hot summer afternoon. He was overseeing the framing of a new warehouse, one of the cornerstones of his empire. He had unrolled a set of blueprints on the hood of his old pickup truck and began tracing the lines with a calloused finger. He had pointed to a complex section of support beams and asked me what I saw. I said I saw lines on a piece of paper. He had shaken his head and smiled. He told me, "No, Sarah. This is the truth. Each one of these lines is a promise. A promise that this roof will not collapse. A promise that the people working inside will be safe. You cannot fake this. You cannot charm your way into a strong foundation. You have to build it right from the ground up." Then he had tapped the worn leather ledger sitting on the passenger seat. He said, "And everything I do, every promise I make, I write it down here. Every deal, every handshake. It is all in the book." That ledger was more than an accounting tool to him. It was his Bible. It was his proof that his word was his bond. His legacy was not just the buildings, it was the integrity with which he built them. Standing there in my mother's sterile living room, I knew I could not betray that. Before I could respond to my mother's proposal, my phone buzzed with a text from work. A 4-car pileup on the interstate. My shift supervisor was asking if I could come in to cover for a colleague who was sick. It was a lifeline. I held up my phone and told them I had to go. There was an emergency. My mother scoffed, unable to comprehend an emergency that did not revolve around her. She said this was more important. I told her people were hurt, and I left before she could argue further. The controlled chaos of the emergency room was a welcome relief. For the next 8 hours, I did not have time to think about inheritances or family betrayals. There was only the immediate pressing reality of medicine. A young boy with a broken arm, an elderly woman struggling to breathe, the controlled rhythm of chest compressions. Here, my purpose was clear. My value was not measured in dollars, but in the lives I could help stabilize and the comfort I could provide to terrified families. My work was real, grounded in a way my mother's world of social climbing and appearances never would be. I finally got home just as the sun was rising. My small apartment felt like a sanctuary. It was not much, just a 1-bedroom filled with secondhand furniture and thriving plants, but it was mine. It was a life I had built on my own terms, funded by my own hard work. I was exhausted, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from making a tangible difference. As I was making coffee, my phone rang. It was Victoria. Her tone had completely shifted from the night before. All the fake sweetness was gone, replaced by an acidic edge. She asked me if I had come to my senses yet. Before I could even answer, she launched into a complaint about her boutique. She said the fall collection was not selling as well as she had hoped. The overhead on that prime downtown location was astronomical. She spoke as if these were my problems to solve. Then came the real reason for her call. She said, "Look, Sarah, things are a little tight right now. I need you to front me about $20,000 just to get through the next quarter." She said it so casually, as if she were asking for a cup of sugar. Not a loan, not a request, a demand. She told me to consider it an advance on my generous allowance once I signed the papers. I was stunned into silence. $20,000. That was nearly half my annual salary. She was treating my grandparents' legacy like her personal ATM before the funds had even cleared probate. I finally found my voice. I said, "Mom, I cannot do that. The estate is still being processed. It is not my money to give." Her reply was instant and cold. She told me not to play dumb with her. She said I was being selfish. She accused me of forgetting where I came from. The call ended with her hanging up on me, but not before she uttered a final chilling sentence. She said, "You will regret this, Sarah. You have no idea who you are dealing with." A cold knot formed in my stomach. This was no longer just about managing an estate. It was about survival. The threat my mother made hung in the air for the rest of the week. I tried to push it aside, focusing on my shifts at the hospital, but it was a low hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. I knew her well enough to know she did not make idle threats. The other shoe was going to drop. I just did not know when or how. It happened on a Saturday. I had just finished a grueling 16-hour double shift and was looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening at home. As I walked up to my apartment door, I saw a crisp white envelope taped to it. It was from the building's management company. My heart sank. I knew instantly this was it. Inside the letter was brutally efficient. It was a notice of lease termination. It stated that due to a change in ownership policy, all month-to-month leases were being terminated, and I had 30 days to vacate the premises. 30 days. I sank onto my sofa, the letter trembling in my hand. It was not a coincidence. It could not be. My mother knew I lived paycheck to paycheck. Finding a new apartment in this city, especially one that allowed pets and coming up with a security deposit and first month's rent in just 30 days, would be nearly impossible on my salary. I immediately called the management company, my voice tight with a mixture of anger and panic. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. She said the decision came from the new parent corporation that had recently acquired the building. She gave me the name of the LLC. It sounded vaguely familiar, but I could not place it. She said there were no exceptions. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, the name of that LLC echoing in my mind. Then a cold realization washed over me. I remembered my stepfather Robert bragging at a family dinner a few years ago about a new real estate venture he and my mother were getting into, buying up mid-range apartment buildings as a side investment. He had mentioned the name of their new holding company. It was the same name. They owned my building. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This was not a random policy change. This was a targeted attack. My mother had not just threatened me, she had acted. She was using her financial power to make me homeless. She was trying to break me to create a crisis so desperate that I would have no choice but to crawl back to her and sign away my grandparents' legacy in exchange for a roof over my head. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. She was not just trying to take my inheritance. She was trying to dismantle the independent life I had carefully built for myself. She saw my small apartment not as a home, but as a point of leverage, a weakness to be exploited. It was then that I fully understood the ultimatum she had given me in her living room. It was not just about the money. It was about control. She could not stand that my grandparents had given me the one thing she could no longer hold over me: financial independence. And so she was doing everything in her power to take it away. I was her daughter, and she was trying to put me out on the street. My first instinct was to fight. I spent hours online researching tenant rights, looking for loopholes, anything that could stop this. But the reality was grim. My month-to-month lease gave them the legal right to terminate with 30 days' notice. They had done everything by the book. It was a perfectly legal, perfectly ruthless move. Defeated, I realized there was no legal recourse. There was only family. Swallowing my pride, I drove to my mother's house. I was not going to beg, but I had to try to appeal to whatever shred of maternal instinct she had left. I found her in the backyard directing a landscaping crew as they rearranged a perfectly good flower bed. She saw me approach, and a small, triumphant smile touched her lips before she masked it with a look of feigned concern. I got straight to the point. I told her I knew she and Robert owned my apartment building. I asked her why she was doing this. She did not deny it. Instead, she sighed dramatically as if I were a difficult child. She said, "Sarah, I am doing this for your own good. You are in over your head. This inheritance is a burden, not a gift. I am simply creating a situation where you will be forced to accept the help you so desperately need. My help. The condescension was suffocating. She was framing her cruelty as an act of maternal care. I tried a different approach. I talked about my job, the long hours, the emotional toll. I told her that my apartment was my only sanctuary, the only place I could decompress after a difficult shift. I asked her, as my mother, how she could take that away from me. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a hint of hesitation. She looked away toward the house. She said, "It does not have to be this way, you know. Just sign the papers, Sarah. Let me handle everything. You can have a beautiful new condo, anything you want. We can go back to being a family." It was a test, a final transactional offer. The hope that had flickered within me died. She was not offering a solution. She was restating her terms of surrender. My voice was quiet when I replied. "I said so my having a home is conditional on me giving you $35 million. That is not family, Mom. That is extortion." Her face hardened. The brief moment of softness was gone, replaced by the same cold fury I had seen in the lawyer's office. She said, "I gave you a choice. If you choose to be stubborn, if you choose your grandparents' money over your own mother, then you have to live with the consequences." The landscapers had stopped working, pretending to inspect their tools, but listening intently. My humiliation was complete. She had made it clear. There was no negotiation. There was no compromise. I had made my choice, and now she was going to make me pay for it. I walked away from her that day knowing I was not just losing my apartment. I was losing my mother for good. The eviction notice was just the beginning. My mother, having failed to break me with a direct financial threat, moved on to a more insidious form of warfare. She began a targeted campaign against my reputation, aiming to isolate me from any support system I had left. It started subtly. My Aunt Carol called her voice thick with fake sympathy. She said she heard I was having financial trouble and that Victoria was terribly worried about me. She told me I was being foolish and ungrateful and that I was tearing the family apart over money. The narrative was set. I was the greedy, unstable daughter causing all the problems. Then things escalated. I started hearing whispers at work. A colleague who was a distant acquaintance of my mother's asked me if everything was okay at home. She said she had heard a rumor that I had a falling out with my family because I was mishandling my inheritance. The poison was spreading. My mother was using her extensive social network to paint a picture of me as mentally fragile and financially irresponsible, a dangerous combination for a paramedic. She was trying to undermine my professional credibility. The most painful blow came a week later. It was the annual fundraising dinner for the hospital. It was a big event, and I always looked forward to it. As I was getting ready, I got a call from my supervisor. He was incredibly awkward and apologetic. He said that a major donor had expressed concerns about my presence at the event. The donor, he explained, was a close friend of my mother's. He told me that under the circumstances, it might be best if I did not attend. I was being uninvited from my own work event. I felt a cold, sinking feeling in my stomach. This was not just social gossip anymore. This was a direct attack on my livelihood. The donor was one of the hospital's biggest benefactors, someone my mother knew from her country club. She had leveraged her social standing to directly interfere with my career. She was systematically cutting me off, not just from my family, but from my professional community as well. She was making it clear that her influence reached far beyond the walls of her sterile white mansion. She could touch every part of my life. I was no longer just fighting for my grandparents' legacy. I was fighting for my own name, my own career, and my own future. And I was completely, terrifyingly alone. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet desperation. I spent every spare moment searching for a new apartment, but it was hopeless. The city's rental market was brutal, and on a single paramedic salary, my options were limited to grim basement units in unsafe neighborhoods. The deadline on my eviction notice loomed a ticking clock counting down to the moment I would be officially homeless. The pressure was immense, a constant weight that made it hard to sleep, hard to eat, hard to think. The stress began to take a physical toll. I was perpetually exhausted running on coffee and adrenaline. My focus, which was usually razor-sharp during emergencies, started to feel frayed at the edges. I was double-checking my own work, second-guessing my instincts. The smear campaign my mother had orchestrated created a subtle chill at the hospital. Colleagues were polite but distant. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in the one place I used to feel competent and respected. The breaking point came during a late-night shift. We got a call for a multi-vehicle accident on the rain-slicked highway. It was bad. When we arrived, the scene was a tangle of crushed metal and flashing lights. My partner and I immediately went to work triaging patients, our training kicking in. I was stabilizing a woman trapped in her car when it happened. As I was trying to insert an IV line, my hands, usually so steady, started to shake. I could not get the needle in. The patient was bleeding. Her blood pressure was dropping and my hands were betraying me. My partner saw me struggling. He gently pushed me aside and took over sinking the IV on the first try with practiced ease. He did not say anything, but his look was a mixture of concern and disappointment. In that moment, something inside me shattered. The one thing I had left, the one thing my mother could not touch, was my skill as a paramedic. And now the stress she had inflicted was destroying that too. I was becoming a liability, a danger to my patients. After the call back at the station, I felt a wave of dizziness and nausea. My vision blurred at the edges. I stumbled to the break room and collapsed into a chair, my head spinning. My captain found me there a few minutes later, pale and trembling. He took one look at me and made the decision. He told me, "Foster, you are done. You are on mandatory leave until you get yourself sorted out. I am not putting you back in that truck until you are fit for duty." I did not have the energy to argue. He was right. As I walked out of the hospital and into the cold night, the full weight of my situation crashed down on me. I had less than a week until I was evicted. I was now suspended from my job. I had no family, my professional life was in jeopardy, and I was about to be homeless. I had been pushed to the absolute edge. My mother had won. She had broken me. I got into my car with nowhere to go, and for the first time since my grandparents died, I truly, completely gave up. I drove away from the hospital that night with no destination in mind. My apartment felt like a ticking time bomb, not a home. My job was gone, at least for now. My family was a source of pain, not comfort. I was adrift. For a moment, I considered the unthinkable, just driving until my car ran out of gas, leaving everything behind. But then an image of my grandparents surfaced in my mind. I remembered my grandmother Maria sitting with me after I had failed my first driving test. She had not offered empty platitudes. She had simply said, "Sometimes, Sarah, the only way forward is to stop, take a breath, and look at the map again." And that is what I did. I pulled over into a quiet, empty parking lot and shut off the engine. The silence was absolute. The despair was a heavy blanket. But underneath it, a tiny ember of something else began to glow. Anger. A cold, clear, clarifying anger. My mother had not just attacked me, she had insulted the memory of my grandparents. She had taken their legacy of hard work and integrity and tried to twist it into a weapon of brute force and control. They had not built their empire just for it to be used for something so ugly. In that moment of absolute clarity, I knew what I had to do. I was done reacting. I was done being the victim. It was time to stop looking at the problem and start looking at the map. I picked up my phone, my hands no longer shaking, and made the call I should have made weeks ago. Matthew Goldstein answered on the second ring, his voice warm despite the late hour. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him everything. The eviction notice, the smear campaign at work, the mandatory leave. I laid it all out, my voice flat and devoid of the tears I thought would come. When I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he said two words that changed everything. He said, "I know. I have been waiting for your call." He went on to explain that my grandparents had anticipated this. Not the exact details, but the scorched earth tactics my mother would employ. They knew her hunger for control, her obsession with social standing. He said, "Sarah, your grandparents did not just leave you their assets, they left you a fortress. You just have not found the key yet." He told me to stop by his office first thing in the morning. He said there were things I needed to see, preparations Frank and Maria had made years ago. As I hung up the phone, the despair that had crippled me was gone, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. The game had changed. My mother thought she was playing chess with a pawn. She had no idea she was playing against a strategy that had been set in motion by the king and queen long before the first move was even made. I drove not to my apartment, but to the one place that felt like a true sanctuary, my grandparents' house. I let myself in with the key I had been given and walked through the silent rooms. It was no longer a house of grief. It was a war room, and I was finally ready to plan my counterattack. I slept in my grandparents' guest room that night, a deep, dreamless sleep, the first I had had in weeks. When I woke, the morning sun was streaming through the windows, and for the first time since the will reading, I did not feel a sense of dread. I felt a purpose. Matthew's office was exactly as I remembered it, but this time I walked in not as a grieving granddaughter, but as a client ready for battle. He did not waste time with sympathy. He gestured for me to sit and placed a heavy leather-bound box on the conference table between us. He said your grandfather called this his insurance policy. He opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, was the ledger I remembered from my childhood, the one my grandfather had called his Bible. But underneath it was something else. There was a stack of manila folders, each neatly labeled with a date, and beside them a small encrypted hard drive. Matthew began to explain. For the last 15 years of their lives, after my mother's demands had become more aggressive, my grandparents had meticulously documented everything. The ledger contained records of every dollar Victoria had ever borrowed and never repaid, with dates, amounts, and the flimsy excuses she had given. The folders contained photocopies of signed loan agreements, bounced checks, and even printed out emails where she begged for money to fund her lavish lifestyle, all while claiming to be a successful businesswoman. But the hard drive was the real bombshell. My grandfather, a man who barely trusted a calculator, had, with the help of a security consultant, installed a discreet closed-circuit camera system in his home office. The hard drive contained hours of footage of my mother verbally abusing my grandmother when she was refused money, footage of her trying to pressure my grandfather into signing documents he had not read. It was a complete, undeniable record of her character. And then Matthew revealed the masterstroke. He pulled out one final document. It was a thick contract, a master loan agreement that consolidated all of my mother's various debts to her parents over the years, which she had signed just 2 years prior in exchange for a significant sum to expand her boutique. And buried deep within the legal jargon on page 17 was a single powerful paragraph. My grandfather had nicknamed it the Heritage Clause. It stated that if the borrower Victoria ever initiated or participated in a legal challenge to their final will and testament, all outstanding debts would become immediately due and payable within 24 hours. Failure to pay would give the executor of the estate the right to place a lien on and begin proceedings to seize all of the borrower's business and personal assets. I stared at the clause, reading it over and over. It was a perfectly legal, perfectly constructed trap. It was a shield forged from my mother's own greed. She would be the one to spring it on herself. My grandparents had not just left me a fortune, they had left me a weapon, a defensive one designed only to activate if my mother attacked first. A slow smile spread across my face. Matthew saw it and nodded. He said they knew this day would come, Sarah. They just wanted to make sure you were the one holding the shield, not the one facing the sword. I left his office that day with the box in my hands. The 30-day eviction notice was still a problem. My job was still on hold. But none of that mattered anymore. Those were just battles. I now had the strategy to win the war. The next 6 months were a masterclass in strategic patience. Armed with the knowledge my grandparents had given me, the fear that had once paralyzed me was gone. I moved out of my apartment before the 30 days were up, placing my belongings in a storage unit and officially moving into my grandparents' house. I let my mother think she had won that battle, that she had successfully uprooted me. I even let the rumor that I was struggling financially continue to circulate. It was better that she underestimated me. I took a voluntary leave of absence from my paramedic job, telling my captain I needed time to get the estate in order. In reality, I was using the time to learn. Matthew Goldstein became my mentor. I spent days at his office poring over the real estate documents, learning the intricacies of the business my grandfather had built. I met with their financial advisors, their property managers, the loyal team of people who had helped them run their empire for decades. They had all been waiting ready to help me just as my grandparents had requested. My primary focus, however, was establishing the Frank and Maria Foster Foundation. It was the core of their legacy, a way to channel their wealth back into the community. We set up scholarships for underprivileged students wanting to enter trade schools and medical programs. It was a tribute to both my grandfather, the builder, and to me, the paramedic. All the while, my mother was oblivious. She saw my silence as weakness. She saw my focus on charity as proof that I was naive and incapable of managing real money. She continued her social maneuvering, positioning herself as the concerned matriarch burdened by a daughter who was in over her head. The perfect opportunity to set the stage finally presented itself. The foundation's first official event was to be a charity gala, a major fundraiser to officially launch our scholarship program. We booked the grand ballroom at the city's most prestigious hotel. It was the kind of high-profile event my mother could not possibly resist. It was her world, her stage. And just as I predicted, she made her move. Through her network of society contacts, she had herself appointed to the gala's honorary host committee. It was a meaningless title, but it gave her a reason to be involved, to be seen. She saw it as a way to publicly align herself with the foundation, a stepping stone to eventually seizing control. She sent me a condescending email saying she was delighted to help guide me through the complexities of hosting such an important event. She had no idea that she was not a guide. She was the guest of honor at a party designed entirely for her. The venue was chosen. The date was set. The trap was ready. All I had to do was wait for her to walk into it. The morning of the gala arrived crisp and clear. An almost unnerving calm had settled over me. For months, I had been moving pieces around a board, preparing for this single night. There was nothing left to do but watch the game play out. I was at the hotel ballroom overseeing the final setup with the event planner when my phone vibrated. It was a text from Matthew. It contained only 3 words. "The Eagle has landed." It was our code. It meant that my mother, true to form, had finally made her move. She had officially filed the lawsuit to contest the will. A slow, cold wave of adrenaline washed through me. This was the moment. Her official legal action was the key that unlocked the entire mechanism my grandparents had built. The heritage clause was now active. The 24-hour countdown had begun. I texted him back a single word: proceed. Miles away, Matthew set the counterplan in motion. He contacted a licensed process server, a man who had been on standby for this exact moment. He gave him the address to my mother's boutique. He also made a call to a trusted contact at the county courthouse, ensuring the necessary paperwork for the lien would be expedited the moment the 24-hour window closed. Everything was timed to the minute. My mother, of course, knew nothing. She spent her day preparing for her grand performance. I saw her posts on social media, a picture from her hair salon, a sneak peek of her designer gown. She was crafting the image of the elegant, concerned matriarch, ready for her moment in the spotlight. She believed she was in complete control, that her lawsuit was a masterful opening move that would force my hand. She thought she was the predator circling her wounded prey. Later that afternoon, I received a call from my Aunt Carol. Her voice was a syrupy blend of fake concern and poorly hidden glee. She told me she heard what Victoria was doing and she thought it was for the best. She said, "Sarah, it is time to stop fighting. Just give your mother what she wants. It will be easier for everyone." I listened patiently, thanked her for her advice, and hung up. They were all so certain of my defeat. They saw a quiet paramedic, not the granddaughter of a master strategist. As I got ready that evening, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was not the same woman who had collapsed in the hospital break room 6 months ago. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. I was not just wearing a simple, elegant black dress. I was wearing armor. And I was not just going to a party. I was going to a coronation. Not hers. Mine. The grand ballroom was a sea of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air buzzed with the polite chatter of the city's elite. I moved through the crowd, greeting guests, my outward demeanor calm and gracious. But inwardly, I was a coiled spring, every sense heightened, watching my mother work the room. She was in her element, flitting from group to group, accepting compliments on the event's success as if she were the sole architect of the evening. She was playing the part of the proud mother, the benevolent guiding hand behind her well-meaning but inexperienced daughter. The program for the evening went smoothly. Speeches were made. A silent auction raised an impressive amount for the foundation. Finally, it was my turn to take the stage to present the inaugural scholarship awards. I stood at the podium looking out at the faces of the donors, the community leaders, and the hopeful young students who were the reason we were all here. I spoke from the heart. I talked about my grandparents not as business titans, but as a builder and a caregiver who believed in the power of a solid foundation, both in buildings and in people. I spoke of their integrity, their work ethic, and their quiet generosity. I shared my own story of being a paramedic, of seeing firsthand how a single moment of support can change a person's life. The room was silent, captivated. For the first time, people were seeing me not as Victoria's daughter or a surprising heiress, but as a person with her own voice, her own purpose. As I finished my speech to a warm round of applause, I saw my mother approaching the stage from the side. This was it. She had a fixed, saccharine smile on her face. She took the secondary microphone, acting as if this was a planned part of the program. She began, her voice filled with practiced emotion. She praised my heartfelt words and spoke of how proud she was. Then she pivoted. She said, as my daughter's mother, and as the daughter of Frank and Maria, my primary concern has always been the responsible stewardship of their legacy. She spoke of the immense pressure I was under, the complexity of the estate. And then she delivered the line she had been rehearsing all night. She looked out at the crowd, a picture of maternal anguish. She said, that is why, with a heavy heart, I felt it was my duty to take legal action this morning. I have petitioned the court to provide oversight for the estate to ensure my parents' hard-earned legacy is protected for generations to come. A shocked murmur went through the ballroom. She had done it. She had publicly declared war painting herself as the responsible adult and me as the incompetent child who needed supervision. She thought she had just checkmated me in front of the entire world. My mother stood there bathed in the spotlight, soaking in the drama she had created. She expected me to cry, to protest, to look like a cornered animal. Instead, I remained perfectly still. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the back of the room. It was the signal. As if on cue, a side door opened and Matthew Goldstein walked in, followed by two other men in dark suits. They did not rush. They walked with a calm, deliberate purpose that immediately drew every eye in the room. They walked directly to the stage. My mother's smile faltered. She looked confused. She asked Matthew, "What is the meaning of this?" "This is a private family matter." Matthew stepped up to the podium and took the microphone I offered him. He looked out at the silent watching crowd. He said it was a private family matter. "Until you made it public, Victoria. And since you chose this stage to announce your lawsuit, it seems only fitting to respond on the same stage." He addressed the audience directly. He said what Victoria failed to mention is that her legal action this morning was not just a lawsuit, it was a trigger. It activated a specific provision in a legally binding master loan agreement she signed with her parents 2 years ago, the Heritage Clause. A low gasp rippled through the room. My mother's face had gone from confused to pale. Matthew's voice was clear and cold, a surgeon's scalpel dissecting her lies. He continued, this clause states that upon initiating any legal challenge to the will, all of her outstanding personal and business debts to the estate become immediately due. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Victoria became liable for the repayment of $780,000. The number hung in the air, stunning the crowd into absolute silence. My mother looked like she had been physically struck. Matthew was not finished. He said the clause gave her 24 hours to remit payment. That deadline is approaching. Since no payment has been received, the estate, under the direction of its sole heir, Sarah Foster, has exercised its legal right. 15 minutes ago, pursuant to a court order, a public notice of asset seizure was executed at Victoria's primary place of business, her boutique downtown. It happened at that exact moment. A wave of light spread through the darkened ballroom as dozens of guests pulled out their phones. A news alert had just gone out. A photo taken by a press photographer who had been tipped off was already trending online. It showed the gleaming glass front of my mother's boutique, her name in elegant script above the door, and plastered diagonally across the entrance was a bright red official notice of seizure. She was not just ruined. She was publicly, spectacularly ruined. Her carefully constructed world of social prestige had been demolished in a single perfectly executed blow. The aftermath on stage was a blur of silent chaos. My mother stood frozen for a moment, her face a ghastly shade of white, the microphone dangling limply from her hand. The image on 100 tiny screens around the room reflected her own public crucifixion. The carefully crafted mask of the elegant socialite had not just slipped, it had been shattered into a million pieces. Then, with a strangled gasp, she turned and fled, stumbling off the side of the stage and disappearing through a service exit. The room erupted in a cacophony of hushed, frantic whispers. The gala was over. The story of the night was not about charity, it was about the spectacular implosion of Victoria Foster. In the days that followed, the consequences cascaded. The story was mercilessly picked up by local news outlets and society blogs. The photo of the seizure notice on her boutique door was everywhere. Her name, once a symbol of social aspiration, became a punchline. The business she had poured so much of my grandparents' money into was effectively dead. With its assets frozen and its reputation in tatters, bankruptcy was inevitable. The vendors, the designers, the wealthy clientele, they all vanished overnight. No one wanted to be associated with that kind of public humiliation. Her social life, the very oxygen she breathed, was cut off. Invitations to parties and board meetings stopped arriving. Calls went unanswered. The friends who had once flocked to her side now crossed the street to avoid her. In her world, financial failure was a weakness, but public disgrace was a fatal disease. She had built her entire identity on a foundation of appearances, and now that foundation had been publicly demolished. My stepfather Robert tried to do damage control. He called Matthew, alternating between blustering threats and desperate pleas. But the legal position was ironclad. The contract was valid. The debt was real. The seizure was legal. There was no way out. He quickly distanced himself from my mother's actions, claiming he had advised against the lawsuit, a transparent attempt to save his own skin. My Aunt Carol and Uncle Ben also called, their tones now dripping with a newfound respect. They praised my business acumen, my strength. They condemned Victoria's recklessness. Their loyalty shifted as quickly as the tide flowing towards the new center of power. I listened to their transparent flattery, thanked them for their call, and made a mental note of who they truly were. The lawsuit, of course, was immediately withdrawn, but the damage was done. My mother had gambled everything on one final arrogant move, and she had lost in the most public way imaginable. She had tried to take my home, my career, and my inheritance. In the end, she had only succeeded in destroying her own. My grandparents had not sought revenge. They had simply built a mirror, and when my mother was forced to look into it, the reflection destroyed her. She was left with nothing but the consequences of her own character. In the quiet weeks after the gala, the chaos subsided, replaced by a strange new reality. The members of my extended family who had once stood united with my mother began a slow, awkward pilgrimage back to me. It started with my Uncle Ben, who sent a timid text message asking if we could get coffee. When we met, he apologized profusely. He admitted he had never felt right about Victoria's plan, but had been too intimidated to speak up. He spoke of his own admiration for my grandparents and said he was glad to see their legacy was in good hands. It was a guarded, hesitant first step. My Aunt Carol was next, though her approach was less sincere. She called and gushed about the success of the foundation offering to volunteer to help in any way she could. Her attempt to align herself with my new position was transparent, but I remained polite and non-committal. The lines had been drawn, and I was no longer the naive niece who could be easily manipulated. The most difficult conversation was with my stepfather, Robert. He requested a formal meeting at Matthew's office. He came not as a family member, but as a businessman seeking a truce. He explained that his and my mother's finances were now completely severed. He was trying to salvage his own reputation from the wreckage she had caused. He made it clear that he was not asking for money. He was asking for a clean break, a way to move forward without being tethered to her downfall. Through all of this, my mother remained silent. I heard through my aunt that she had retreated, completely refusing to see or speak to anyone. She had lost her business, her social standing, and now her husband. She was isolated in her large, empty house, a prisoner of the same public opinion she had once weaponized against me. It was during this time that I realized I had to define the terms of our future, if there was to be one at all. With Matthew's help, I drafted a simple one-page document. It was not a legal contract, but a personal one, a statement of boundaries. It said that I was open to the possibility of a future relationship with any family member, but it would be conditional. It would require mutual respect. It would require an absolute end to any discussion of the inheritance, and it would require a genuine acknowledgement of the harm that had been done. There would be no more transactions, no more leverage, no more manipulation, only a relationship based on honesty, or no relationship at all. I sent a copy to each of them. My Uncle Ben called immediately and said he understood and agreed completely. My Aunt Carol was silent for a week before sending a short formal email of acceptance. Robert signed his copy and had it delivered by courier. From my mother, there was only silence. The terms had been set. The choice was now theirs. I had taken back control, not just of my inheritance, but of the very definition of what family meant to me. With the drama of my family finally settled into a quiet, manageable distance, I was able to turn my full attention to the work that truly mattered. The Frank and Maria Foster Foundation became the center of my world. The publicity from the gala, though born from conflict, had an unintended positive effect. It put the foundation on the map. Donations began to come in from people who had been moved by my grandparents' story and my commitment to honoring their values. I went back to work as a paramedic, but with a new sense of purpose. My captain, who had heard the full story, welcomed me back with a quiet nod of respect. I used my own funds to anonymously donate new state-of-the-art equipment to our ambulance service, things we had needed for years but could never afford. My colleagues never knew it was me, but seeing them work with better tools, knowing we could provide better care, was a reward in itself. The Foundation's first major project was ambitious. We partnered with the local community college to create a new scholarship program specifically for students entering vocational trades and emergency medical services. It was the perfect fusion of my grandparents' legacies. The Frank Foster Grant for Skilled Trades honored my grandfather, the builder who believed in the dignity of working with your hands, and the Maria Foster Scholarship for Future Medics honored my grandmother, the caregiver, and connected directly to my own life's work. The first scholarship ceremony was a small, intimate affair held at the community college, a world away from the glittering ballroom of the gala. There were no reporters, no society figures, just the students, their proud families, and the Foundation's board. One of the first recipients of the paramedic scholarship was a young woman named Elena. She was a single mother working 2 jobs while trying to get her certification. Her story was one of incredible resilience and determination. When I called her name, she walked to the podium, tears streaming down her face. She told the small crowd that this scholarship was not just about the money, it was about someone believing in her. It was about giving her a chance to build a better life for her daughter. She said she wanted to be a paramedic to show her little girl what it meant to be strong, to help people, to be a hero in your own community. Listening to her speak, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The $35 million, the legal battles, the family betrayal, it had all been noise. This was the signal. This was the real inheritance. It was not the money itself, but the power to create moments like this, the power to invest in people like Elena, the power to turn wealth into opportunity, to transform a financial ledger into a legacy of hope. I was not just managing my grandparents' assets. I was growing their garden planting seeds that would blossom in ways they could only have imagined. My grandparents' house, once a symbol of my grief and the battlefield for my inheritance, slowly began to transform. The silence that had once felt so heavy was gradually replaced by warmth and laughter. It started with Matthew Goldstein. After our long days working on foundation business, he would often stay for dinner. We would sit at the simple kitchen table where I had shared so many meals with my grandparents, and he would tell me stories about them, tales of their early struggles and quiet triumphs that painted an even richer picture of the people they were. Soon our dinners expanded. I invited Carlos, the estate manager, who had been my silent guardian through the worst of it. He brought his wife Sophia and their 2 young children. Their laughter echoed through the halls, chasing away the last of the ghosts. Sophia, a wonderful cook, insisted on teaching me my grandmother's recipes, patiently guiding my hands as we recreated the dishes I had loved as a child. The scent of my grandmother's cooking once again filled the house, but this time it was not a memory. It was a living, breathing thing. Elena, the first recipient of our paramedic scholarship, became a regular visitor. After she finished her certification and started her first job, she would come by on her days off, her young daughter in tow. I would help her daughter with her homework while Elena shared stories from her shifts, the triumphs, and the heartbreaks. We found an easy camaraderie in our shared profession, a bond of understanding that went deeper than words. One Sunday afternoon, we were all gathered in the backyard for a barbecue. Carlos was at the grill, Matthew was engaged in a serious game of tag with the kids, and Sophia and I were setting out plates of food. Elena was there along with a few other scholarship students and some of the loyal, long-time employees from my grandparents' company. The air was filled with the easy, comfortable chatter of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. I looked around at the scene. This collection of people from such different walks of life had become my community. They were not bound by blood, but by shared values of integrity, hard work, and mutual respect. They had stood by me not because they had to, but because they chose to. They had seen me at my lowest and had helped me rise. A wave of emotion washed over me so powerful it took my breath away. This was family. Not the transactional, conditional version I had grown up with, but something real and true. A chosen family forged in adversity and cemented in genuine affection. My grandparents had not just left me a house and a portfolio. They had left me the seeds of this community, a network of good people they had trusted. It was my job to nurture it, to bring them together, to build a new kind of family on the strong foundation they had provided. In losing the family I was born into, I had finally found the one where I truly belonged. A year to the day after the gala, I found myself driving down a familiar road. It led to the small, quiet cemetery where my grandparents were laid to rest. I had not been back since the funeral. The pain had been too raw, the memories too tangled up in the conflict that followed. But today felt different. I brought a simple bouquet of wildflowers from the garden Carlos now tended with such care. I sat on the small bench facing their headstone, the polished granite warm from the autumn sun. The silence here was peaceful, not empty. For a long time, I just sat letting the memories come. I thought about my grandfather teaching me how to read a blueprint and my grandmother showing me how to balance a checkbook. They had not just taught me practical skills, they had taught me a way of being in the world. I told them about the foundation, about Elena and the other students. I told them about the Sunday barbecues, about the laughter that now filled their home. I told them that I finally understood. Their true legacy was never the $35 million. That was just the tool. The real inheritance was the lesson that you build your life not with what you have, but with what you do. You build it with integrity, with purpose, and with the people you choose to surround yourself with. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak tree nearby, and for a moment it felt like an answer. A sense of peace settled over me, a feeling of closure that had nothing to do with money or legal victories. I had protected their legacy not by hoarding it, but by putting it to work, by turning it into something that would continue to grow and give back long after I was gone. The war was over, and I had found my peace. I was no longer just the granddaughter who inherited a fortune. I was the steward of a legacy, the center of a chosen family, and the architect of my own life built on the strongest foundation I could have ever asked for. Looking back on it all, the money did what money always does. It revealed the truth. It showed me that the family you are born into is not always the one you belong to. And it taught me that true strength is not about how much you can take, but about how much you can build and what you are willing to protect. It is about knowing your own worth, even when the people who are supposed to love you the most try to make you feel worthless. My story had a dramatic outcome, but the core of it is something I think many of us face in quieter ways every day. We face moments where we have to choose between what is easy and what is right, between keeping a toxic peace and drawing a healthy boundary. So, I want to ask you, have you ever had a moment where you had to stand up for your own values, even when it was incredibly difficult? What did you learn from it? Share your story in the comments below. I read every one, and I believe our stories are how we build our own community right here. And if this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you know. Thank you for listening, and remember to keep building on your own strong foundation.